Inventions that killed their inventors. You ever get crammed and jammed in seemingly endless traffic and you just wanna... Whoop, not that. Roll it again. You ever get crammed and jammed in seemingly endless traffic and you just wanna... Well, that's what this saucy rack of ribs tried to invent in the early 1970s. This is Henry Smolinski, a certified American aerospace engineer with a small car and a big dream. Partnered in business with his business partner and fellow engineer Harold Blake, the two sought to develop a compact and affordable flying car to cut down on highway congestion. This completely disregards the fact that 33.33% of drivers can't drive for shit, but I guess they thought expanding the margin of error from a simple road to the entire fucking sky was a solid business plan, but I digress. The two fine fellas founded their own company, Advanced Vehicle Engineers. Together, they began to lay the groundwork, spending countless hours conceptualizing their design. Okay, but how are we gonna make the plane fly? But after a while, there was an epiphany. I got it. The two engineers would take a small car and a small plane and just kinda fuse them together. Yeah, that was the plan. Their invention, dubbed the Mizar, was a makeshift, sloppy, back-alley love child of an affordable, lightweight, and rather volatile Ford Pinto, combined with the wings and engine of a Cessna Skymaster. Just slap them bad boys together with a few screws and a couple of prayers, and you've conceptually got yourself a flying car. The basic rundown of the Mizar was for owners to drive to their nearby airport, lock the detachable wings to their cars, piss off the local air traffic controllers, fly to another airport near their desired destination, detach the wings for storage, and drive off to where they needed to be, theoretically skipping over large portions of traffic. Once the workday was done, just reverse the process and you're home safe and sound just in time to dropkick your wife for spilling your spaghetti TV dinner all over the conversation pit. This was the 70s after all. Such a life-changing experience could be yours for the low price of 29 grand. And that's in 1970s dollars. That translates to about $210,000 in today's money. For comparison, the average cost of a new car in the early 1970s was about $4,000, so it wasn't exactly as affordable as they planned, but oh well, flying car. The design was finalized and a prototype was ready for testing. Professional pilot Charles Janice was hired to take the wheel. Now, he managed to get the craft airborne, but only for a few minutes. Shortly after takeoff, a portion of the mounting of the wings suddenly snapped, completely crippling Charles's turning ability. If he were to try to turn the plane, his wings would buckle under aeronautical stresses and send him careening back to Earth in a very foreshadowy type death. Instead, Charles skillfully and poetically landed the Pinto in a nearby bean field just a few miles from the runway. With a police escort, he managed to drive the car-plane hybrid back to the airport. However, such a high-profile landing of a prototype aircraft caught the attention of the National Transportation Safety Board. They investigated the root cause of the emergency landing and found the Mizar's design to just be plain terrible. The car was shoddily welded to the aircraft frame, which was already severely overburdened by the car's 2,000-pound weight. Any other components connecting the car to the wings were cheap, structurally questionable, and the engineering equivalent of duct tape. It got the job done, sure, but just barely. And if you're risking your life to fly or just be in a plane, you don't want it to be just barely functional. Right, Boeing? Nah, they know. Despite several warnings from the NTSB, Smolinski and Blake just kinda shrugged the whole fiasco off. Since they were able to capture real footage of their revolutionary product physically flying through the sky, publicity surrounding the Mizar soon took off. Multiple pre-orders poured in from consumers looking to have that unforgettable experience of clenching their buttholes to each and every metal creak as they haphazardly glide through the skies in an amalgamation of steel. Fun fact though, since this was late 1973, you theoretically could pop on Freebird to maximize the experience. Now, the promotional footage was alright, but the two engineers needed themselves a fully sustained successful flight to really seal the deal. Completely ignoring all NTSB recommendations to make their aircraft safer and even neglecting to address the issues from the previous failed attempt, the only change that they made was slamming on a bigger, heavier engine to help sustain flight. They even phoned up their pilot pal Charles to lead the second charge. He said no. So, on September 11th, 1973, the two towering engineers buckled themselves up for the ride. But when problems aren't addressed, history is a funny way of repeating itself. Just a few minutes into their flight, the compromised wings began to fail under the weight of the new engine, and with one small turn, everything began to fall apart. literally. The wings effectively disintegrated and tore themselves away from the car, leaving Henry and Harold to nosedive back to Earth. With a single fatal slam, the two engineers met their demise, taking with them the future of their company, as well as the Mizar. Traffic doesn't seem so bad now, does it? Time to go from acrophobia to thalassophobia. Way before we had Xbox controllers attempting to navigate us through ocean depths, we had something much more rudimentary. Say hello to the H.L. Hunley, a hand-cranked, human-powered submarine with a big old bomb attached to it. It's like a relaxing paddle boat on a picturesque pond, but compact, cramped, claustrophobic, and with a big old bomb attached to it. This diving death dungeon was the invention of one Horace Lawson Hunley. Look at that, H.L. Hunley. Now, before you think that that's some kind of narcissistic power move, let me explain. But back in the days of the Civil War in the less than United States, the Confederacy was aching in the sack for any kind of technological advantage over the Union. You see, in the early days of the war, the Union had sent out several warships to blockade Confederate ports, most notably in Charleston, South Carolina. With all of these ships just sitting there, menacingly, the Confederacy was powerless to send or receive any supplies lest they be converted into aquarium decorations on the seabed. To make matters worse, the Confederacy didn't really have much in the ways of a formal navy. The Union controlled almost all of the industrial power, and as such, the South didn't have the technology, let alone any firepower capable of taking these Union warships head on. So if they couldn't win face to face, they thought, why not try face to ass? Combatively speaking, of course. Supplying that ingenuity and elbow grease was none other than the aforementioned Confederate Marine engineer Horace Lawson Hunley. Partnered with fellow facial-haired engineers James McClintock and Baxter Watson, the trio developed and tested 3 submersibles. The first one, the Pioneer, was tested in Nolens. But as the North took over the area in 1862, she had to be intentionally sunk to avoid having her design stolen. The second sub, the American Diver, improved on the Pioneer's flaws but ultimately sank in a rather unlucky surge of bad weather not long after. Now that leaves the third sub. Unnamed, this sub further improved on previous designs. Steam and electrical engines were deemed impractical, thus this sub's propulsion was powered by hand. 16 hands, actually. You know, there's nothing like 8 dudes crouched over cranking their shaft while shoulder to shoulder in a confined space. And I mean a real confined space. The sub's hull measured just over 4 feet in diameter, so not only was it an ergonomic hellhole, but all that huffing and puffing from that shaft roughing was actually a huge detriment to the crew. That's because this sub had no air ventilation system, so dives, although only 6 to 10 feet below the surface, were on a biological clock, with most dives lasting no more than a single hour, so missions needed to be quick and efficient or risk disaster. Unfortunately for the vessel, her early crew didn't even make it to the diving stage. Well, not successfully anyway. The captain accidentally triggered a dive while the hatches above were still open, flooding the sub and drowning 5 of the 8 crew. Kinda foreboding. The sub was almost immediately raised and thrown right back into service, but this time, Hunley himself took to the helm to perform a training exercise on October 15th, 1863. The exercise was a success. All Hunley needed to do was float the sub back to the surface. It never came back to the surface. At just 39 years old, Hunley, along with the other 7 men of the crew, drowned after a mechanical failure had compromised the sub's buoyancy. Well, waste not, want not. The Confederacy raised the sub a second time, shook out the bloated corpses, and returned it to service. But this time being formally named the H.L. Hunley in the inventor's honor. See, it wasn't narcissistic, just horribly tragic. Hunley was Dunley, but it wasn't the end of his legacy. The sub, on its 3rd voyage, was tasked with finally making a dent in the Union's South Atlantic blockading squadron. Bunch of bastards. Fully manned, the Hunley carved through the water and commenced its attack on one of the unsuspecting ships. The Hunley managed to blow a hole right into the wooden hull of the USS Housatonic, becoming the first submarine to sink an enemy ship in combat. But there was collateral damage. A lot of it. Although successful, the attack didn't exactly go according to plan. You see, what was supposed to happen was that the charge was to stick to the Housatonic. The charge, still connected to the Hunley with a length of rope, would be detonated after the Hunley backed away a safe distance. After hitting that distance, the tension on the rope would trigger a detonation mechanism, setting off the 135-pound black powder charge. But since this charge was set off on impact, historians agree that the resulting shockwave from the explosion passed right through the sub, drastically shifting the pressure of the air within the vessel and subjecting the crew to a little something called blast lung. Basically, the lungs of each crew member were instantly obliterated, killing all 8 men right where they sat. With its crewy now gone kablooey, the Hunley sank and remained lost for over a century until being rediscovered in 1995. The wreck was raised from the ocean floor in 2000, spooky scary skeletons included. Now we go from thalassophobia to spelunkophobia. Lots of phobias today. You never fully comprehend just how friggin' dark mining used to be back in the days of old. Nowadays, professional mining headlamps are able to churn out about 1,000 lumens. I mean, heck, even your phone screen produces about 600 lumens at full brightness as you blast your retinas at 2 a.m. and wonder why you can't sleep. Now, compare those numbers to actual candlelight, the most basic of lighting technology used since ancient times. Even back then, mine shafts still reached hundreds of feet into the earth, and all you had were a handful of candles to light your way through the dark. So compared to a modern headlamp at 1,000 lumens, a single tallow candle emits only about 15 lumens. Drastically different. Instead of a single lamp lighting up a whole cavern, you had several itty-bitty candles illuminating a small line on the wall. While this was impractical from a vision standpoint, it was also super duper dangerous. When mining for coal, as humans often do, it's very common to release pockets of something called fire damp. Fire damp, if you're unaware, is a mixture of naturally occurring gases, primarily methane. That stuff just naturally ekes out of coal-bearing rock over time. Actively chipping away at it doesn't do you any favors. Now, I'm sure you are aware that introducing methane to an open flame goes about as well as introducing a healthy cactus into your asshole. Miners were always in danger of a sudden explosion from leaking gases creeping across their candles. Well, that's when English lad Carlisle Spedding put his foot down. He came up with this baby in the 1730s, the Carlisle Steel Mill. Why have a somewhat steady emission of dim light from a line of candles when you could just have a dude ripping away on this bad boy? The design was simple, inefficient, and retrospectively stupid. Setting the device on his lap or his leg, the operator pressed a piece of flint against a steel wheel and cranked the crank, hopefully generating a feeble, fleeting stream of sparks. And those sparks served as your light source. Nope, I'm not kidding. So imagine swanging your friggin' sweet third age pickaxe while Sparky Steve over here is sniffing your shoulders and just showering you in fragments of burning rock and metal. Hey. You're doing a good job. The basic idea was that while open flames definitely cause explosions, sparks might not. In theory, they just don't sustain long enough to trigger an explosive reaction. In theory. Now you might be sitting there with potato chips on your belly like, why not just use a lantern? That's a good question, and those are good critical thinking skills. But lanterns weren't exactly gas-proof either. Methane could still leak in through the frame and lick the flame. While Spedding was an inventor, he still served as a hands-on mining engineer, supervising shafts and checking out holes. But on August 8, 1755, in a coal pit in the town of Whitehaven in England, Spedding learned the hard way that even his invention couldn't hold a candle to modern safety practices. Whoop. The poor dude done died in a mining methane explosion, reportedly caused by the sparks of one of his own steel mills. He was 59. Despite the tragedy, the steel mill continued to be used for another 60 years until the invention of the safety lamp in 1815. There were alternatives like calcium carbide lamps, but they were still open flame light sources, so you were just back to square one. Books. Books. Books are neat. Granted, less and less people even read these things nowadays. They were once the absolute only way to store tons of information for scholars and casual readers alike. The invention of the printing press revolutionized the industry and allowed even the poorest fellows to dive into scientific discoveries or fictional realms. Once they learned how to read, of course. I like the pictures. But as humanity continued to evolve, so did the technology. Higher demand required faster, more efficient machines to carry the burden. To help bridge that gap, a rotary printing press was invented in 1843 by American inventor Richard March Hoe. Hoe's design drastically sped up the process. Previous flatbed printers usually capped out at about 1,000 sheets per hour, whereas the rotary press was slinging out 8,000 per hour. Over time, rotary presses grew into more complex and monstrous machines, capable of producing up to 30,000 pages an hour. Good job, but not good job enough. While the throughput was respectable, the machines were very inefficient. Every paper was hand-fed, requiring extensive staffing to keep the machine running. There was also the drawback of each page only being printed one-sided, so printed pages needed to be flipped and re-fed onto another side of the machine to complete it. It was a whole song and dance to make the machine work optimally. But peeking in on the right side of the screen was American inventor William Bullock. He took one look at Hoe's machine and scoffed. Bullock, already a successful inventor with farming tools such as a seed planter, grain drill, and a hay press, looked to expand his catalog. After a few years of making tweaks to Hoe's original design, Bullock unveiled his web rotary printing press in 1863. Using one continuous sheet of paper, the web press could print double-sided and cut pages in a single pass, all while matching Hoe's 30,000 page per hour speed at a fraction of the cost. Bullock's design became the new standard in the printing industry, printing himself a pretty penny in his pocket. But there's never gonna be a more iconic duo than a cluster of moving mechanical parts and a fragile human body. Luckily for Bullock though, he wouldn't be ending up black and blue and red all over, just his leg. One day, while making adjustments to one of his newly installed printing presses, Bullock needed to strap a drive belt onto a pulley. Now, nearby tools were a perfectly suitable option, but Bullock opted for the classic dad move of just kicking that thing right on there, while the machine was still on. With one misplaced kick, his foot had slipped, sending his entire right leg into the drive mechanism of the machine, crushing it like a used-up tube of toothpaste. And this, dear viewer, is why lockout-tagout practices are important. Now, Bullock was rescued from the machine, but the extent of his injuries ultimately proved fatal. Over the next several days, gangrene set in, prompting doctors to attempt to amputate the infected leg. He didn't make it through surgery. Bullock's fate was signed, sealed, and delivered on April 12, 1867. He was 53. Now, this is certainly one of the stranger deaths on the list. Machines can be big and scary, sure, but sometimes Mother Nature is the one that punches us in the face if we don't respect her enough. But someone like Georg Wilhelm Rieckmann already knew that. He was a Russian physicist who pioneered the field of electrical research, mainly naturally occurring electrical phenomena. You know, like lightning. Dangerous business that, but someone has to do it. Might as well be the fellow that's at least passionate about it. To help with his research, Georg designed an electrical rod system that allowed him to measure the intensity of electrical charges in the atmosphere. Ideally, he wanted to quantify the electrical charge of a lightning bolt during a thunderstorm. You can probably already guess how this is going to end. Of course, harnessing the power of a lightning bolt is much easier said than done. Actually, it should never be done unless you have the proper equipment over here and you've fucked off somewhere far away, like over there. But a little bit of safety wasn't going to stop dear Georg's dream. His design was kind of simple. It was basically an insulated iron rod slammed through the roof of his house. The rod was responsible for collecting any electrical charge present in the atmosphere. The charge would then be diverted to a rudimentary electrometer, a secondary insulated iron rod with a linen thread attached to it. When the rod absorbed a charge, the thread would be deflected. That angle of deflection could be measured, allowing the scale of the charge to be quantified. I know this is a bunch of science stuff in a history video, but bear with me. On the fateful day of August 6, 1753 in St. Petersburg, Rieckmann caught wind of a storm brewing outside. He quickly rushed home to conduct a study, bringing with him a witness to record his measurements. The two set up shop in the lab and began their observations. If you ever decide to play around with electricity, the most important thing you need to do is make sure that you, or whatever you're working with, is properly grounded. This gives any sudden, dangerous electrical surges somewhere to go. Somewhere that isn't you. What Rieckmann failed to do, as you could probably guess by my warning, was ground his electrometer. Lightning struck Rieckmann's device. The rod was now overcharged, and that charge was looking for the quickest escape route. Unfortunately for Rieckmann, he was the escape route. According to his witness's testimony, something very strange happened. I wouldn't get too close to that, dude. As Riekman approached the rod to look at the measurement, a bluish white ball of fire about 4 inches in diameter shot from the rod and into his forehead, electrocuting him instantly. The sudden discharge of all of that electricity at once caused a concussive blast that tore through Riekman's lab, knocking the witness unconscious and ripping doors from their hinges. Riekman lay dead on the ground, with his clothes singed and a burn mark on his forehead where the bolt had entered his body, and his left shoe blown open from where it had exited. He was just 42. Now, because of the wording used in the eyewitness testimony, some historians attribute the death to a very rare phenomenon known as ball lightning, but others believe the incident to have merely been a clustered bolt. Either way, don't mess with lightning. It stings.